Alright guys, welcome back. We're looking at chapter 35 of American Pageant, 13th edition, and we are right in the middle of World War II now, and we're going to pick up by looking at some wartime migrations, the movement of people, in other words, and we're going to see millions of Americans moving during World War II. And you can see from the map, quite a few of them are going out to the west and up to the north. We're going to see boomtowns like Detroit, and Seattle and Los Angeles pop up on the map as people are going out there looking for wartime jobs. We're going to see also, while many people, are moving out of the South, we also see some influx of people to the South. So you have this kind of odd situation where people are moving out and also in. And the South is going to get a lot of defense contracts, a lot of this training bases in which Americans are going to, go to basic training during World War II are going to be located in the South. Partly because land was cheaper, but also the climate was more mild, so you can train more soldiers throughout the year, as opposed to having some training base, in North Dakota or something. And I can think of a particular base that was opened right about there. Camp Campbell, as it was known back in World War II, the modern-day Fort Campbell. And by the way, the 101st Airborne did not train at Camp Campbell in Clarksville. They trained down in Georgia. Well, you can look at the map and see some of these big cities in terms of, wartime production. Obviously, a huge clumping here in the Midwest, Northeast, and also out in the West. Now, when we're thinking about migrations, we're going to look at a continuing trend we've already looked at, the thing called the Great Migration, the movement of African Americans from the South to the North and to the West. And in World War II, over 1 million, in fact, over 1.5 million African Americans are going to leave the South. And they wanted a chance to get these wartime jobs too. And so to that end, FDR is going to issue another one of his executive orders. This one is 8802. And it says that in these defense industries, that you are not going to be allowed to have any type of discrimination in terms of hiring and wages. Now, this is not just FDR being nice, this is FDR being realistic, and he's responding to a threat of sorts from A. Philip Randolph, who is a civil rights leader, African-American labor leader, well-known person, who basically said, if you don't make this a level playing field, then we're going to march on Washington. And any type of massive march in Washington, D.C. would be unwelcomed, I guess we'll say, in the middle of World War II by the administration. So they go ahead and kind of get out ahead of it and issue that Executive Order 8802. Now, on the topic of African Americans in World War II, you need to be familiar with the term double V campaign. Double V, a double victory, in other words, a victory over the Nazis and the Japanese and the Italians, certainly, but also a victory over racism at home. This is seen by many African Americans as a chance to really gain some of that equality that had been promised but had never been fully delivered for most black Americans. And, African Americans are going to contribute to the war effort in a big way as well. People are going to be drafted, people are going to volunteer. But this is still the time period of a segregated military. This is something that FDR did not feel comfortable doing. He felt he would basically risk losing support of his Southern Democrats by pushing for a desegregated military. So this will be our last major war with a segregated U.S. military. And you can see an example of one of these groups, the famous Tuskegee Airmen, who fought in Europe, escorting American bombers over German and Italian targets. Native Americans. So we talked about earlier about the so-called Indian New Deal during the 1930s, and our next big topic with Indians, Native Americans, that is, would be the movement of many of them from the reservations to those defense industries. So just like all the other groups of Americans, they were looking for sort of means of getting involved in the war and getting a paycheck. And we're also going to see service from Native Americans as well. The famous Navajo code talkers would be a good example of this. The Navajo language was something that the Japanese simply could not figure out, and so you would send in guys, up in the front lines who would serve as like spotters for artillery or ship bombardment or something like that, and they could relay messages back over the air, knowing that that could be intercepted by the Japanese, but that the Japanese couldn't interpret Navajo language, so it kind of gives these guys up the front lines an advantage over the Japanese. There's a movie of it's just okay. It's called The Wind Talkers. I'm not a big Nicolas Cage fan personally, but check it out if you have nothing else better to do. So cost. World War II, again, biggest war outside of the Civil War America's ever going to fight. Very, very costly. In fact, in 1940s dollars, we're talking a price tag of over $330 billion. Now, if you adjust for inflation, that will be, in modern dollars, about $4 trillion. Now, remember, a trillion is a million millions. We're talking 4 millions of dollars. That's a lot of money. So how do we pay for the war? Well, about 40% comes from increased taxes, income taxes. And in fact, the highest tax brackets were a whopping 94%. So if you were one of the richest Americans, for every $100 you earned, you got to keep 6. The other 94 went back to Uncle Sam. The other 60% of the paying for the war comes simply from borrowing. And borrowing, of course, from the American people. And you're going to see the national debt just climb dramatically during World War II. Now, when I say borrowing from the American people, I'm talking, of course, about war bonds, or victory bonds, as they're also known. And this is a way for Americans, just like in World War I, to contribute to the war effort by setting aside a little bit of money, giving it to the government. The government will give you that money back later. That's what a bond is. It's basically a loan, plus interest. So you'll earn a little bit on this loan, and you get to do the right thing by helping the war effort. You can see the national debt, basically from the beginning of the New Deal, which would be over here, to the end of the New Deal. You see the national debt about doubles, a little bit more than doubles. And then during World War II, the national debt just goes up like a rocket. Well, let's get to the actual fighting of the war now, and we're looking at the Pacific Theater, as it's known, the war against Japan, in other words. And you can see by 1942, the Japanese have taken all of this, including the Philippines, by the way. The Japanese had taken the Philippines early in the war, and Americans had been forced to retreat. Many of them were captured by the Japanese. You may have heard of the famous Bataan Death March, which would have taken place over here. Let's talk now about the Battle of Midway. So let's just jump back to the map for a second. Midway is right here, and it's called Midway because it's about halfway between America, which would be over here, and Japan over there. And in this battle, we're going to see the Japanese attempting to take Midway Island. And by taking Midway, this would allow the Japanese to close in on Hawaii later. It would, again, allow them to basically build this huge network of bases in the Pacific that we would have to fight our way through. So it's just one more piece of the puzzle the Japanese want. There's not much to Midway in terms of an island. It's an atoll in the middle of the Pacific. An atoll forms around a volcano. You can see that would be basically the mouth of the volcano, and this is the rim of it. And these little islands right here constitute Midway. And what's important about them is this right here, these airfields. So in early June 1942, the Japanese closed in on Midway, and we had broken their codes, as we talked about earlier, and we knew fairly well that the Midway was the Japanese target. And so our fleet is out there ready for the Japanese, and in this titanic naval battle, the Japanese are going to lose badly, losing 4 of their aircraft carriers, America only losing 1. And with the Japanese economy being much weaker than America's, to lose 4 aircraft carriers was devastating to the Japanese. It's going to be very difficult for them to replace those in the middle of the war. So Midway really helps turn the tide of the war in the Pacific, at least on the naval front. This is also going to help kind of end the Japanese expansion outwards to the east. But pushing the Japanese back is going to require our island hopping campaign. And you might remember island hopping from your study of world history. Island hopping simply means you're going to go from island chain to island chain, going from the east to the west, closing in on Japan, leapfrogging your way across the Pacific. Now, you're not going to take every single island group. That's unnecessary. You're only going to target the ones that are seen as absolutely necessary to get across the Pacific, leave the other ones behind, basically. And the person kind of in charge of this overall effort is an admiral by the name of Chester W. Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz. And so, just to reiterate what I said, we're going to head this way and this way, kind of working our way across the Pacific, going island chain to island chain, closing in on Japan. And we're not going to look at every single one of these island battles because that's unnecessary, but we will close in on a couple later on by talking about Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Back to the European theater. So, if you're thinking about Hitler and his threat to Britain, his greatest threat was not the tank, not the airplane, not infantry, but submarines. The German U-boats really were the greatest threat to Britain in World War II because Britain is, as an island nation, is vulnerable to blockades. And by 1942, the German wolfpacks were sinking ships faster than they could be produced. And what a wolfpack was is these U-boats are spread out across the Atlantic, the North Atlantic primarily, along these trade routes. And a German U-boat would spot incoming ships, trade ships, merchant ships, and they would radio to their U-boat buddies out there in the Pacific, or excuse me, in the Atlantic, and they would all converge like a wolf pack on the ships and attack them in force. And these were devastating. However, it's not war winning, it turns out, because we were able to, and by we I mean the Allies, us and the British, are going to find ways to counter those U-boats. We're going to use convoys where our merchant ships will be protected by warships. We're going to use radar to detect the German U-boats on the surface at night. We're going to use air patrols constantly flying over the ships to drop bombs on the German submarines. We're going to bomb the German bases in France. We're also going to break the German Enigma code. And this is something the Germans didn't know that we broke, because we're certainly not going to tell them. But by breaking their code and reading their messages, we know we have a much clearer picture where the German submarines are going to be. And so therefore we can ambush them at sea. Alright, now we're going to look at the so-called Second Front with the Big Three. And if you need a reminder of the Big Three, that is Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Stalin is hurting. He is suffering massive losses because about 90% of the German military is faced in on him. It's on Soviet soil, and he needs us to open a so-called Western Front somewhere in Western Europe to divert some of that German strength, to kind of distract the Germans to relieving some pressure on Stalin. Otherwise, he might simply have to cave in. At the Casablanca Conference, which takes place in North Africa, FDR and Churchill meet to begin discussing what their war plans are going to be, how to coordinate and defeat Hitler in Europe. And the two men decided on something called an unconditional surrender policy. In other words, the Axis powers can only surrender unconditionally. They don't get to keep anything. They surrender by agreeing to give up everything. This is not going to be some half-done thing. It's either you give up everything or the war continues until you agree to give up everything. Unconditional surrender. So we invade North Africa. Americans, the British were already there. Clean up the Germans there. And then our soldiers jump across from North Africa into Sicily. Mussolini is overthrown, put under house arrest. And by September 1943, after we land on the mainland itself, Italy surrenders, and they're out of the war. So one of our three Axis powers is out. That does not mean the war in Italy stops, however. The Germans are going to defend the Italian peninsula, and so from September 1943 until the end of the war, the Americans are still fighting and dying in Italy, not against the Italians, but against the Germans. All right, we're going to pick up with D-Day and close out the war in our next video.